Hunters and anglers have a superpower. I have it. You probably have it. I think just about any outdoorsman or woman out there who has fallen in love with the pursuit of turkeys or trout, walleye or whitetails, probably has it too. And that superpower, that incredible gift, is optimism. Despite all the failed casts, the skunked outings, the seasons that just don't go your way, we keep returning to the field and to the water, believing that it's all going to be different this time. Today's going to be the day. This is going to be the year. Just this one last cast, it's going to be the one. To hunt or fish simply demands this kind of optimism, and almost to an unseemly degree. And because of that demand, it also seems to breed more of that same thing. At least from what I can tell, the more you hunt or fish, the more it seems that you become the kind of person that believes good things can happen and that you can make those good things happen. It's for that reason, I believe, that hunting and fishing conservation organizations have become some of the most active and effective in the entire world. These groups, these causes are armed not only with well-appointed strategies and smart people and staff, but also an army of true believers. Men and women who believe that yes, things will work out. Today will be the day. Things can get better. Take, for example, trout and salmon and the many millions of people who obsess over them, myself included. As is the case with so many fish and wildlife today, trout and salmon do face some real challenges amidst this changing world. But at the same time, there is very real cause for optimism about their future too. And much of that, I believe, is because of the legions of incredibly, maybe irrationally optimistic anglers who have dedicated themselves, and sometimes their entire lives, to making sure that that better future becomes a reality. One such angler and optimist is Chris Wood, the president and CEO of Trout Unlimited, one of the largest and most influential conservation groups in the hunting and fishing world. I've asked Chris to join me here today to help me better understand exactly what that future might look like for the fish and the rivers and the still waters that so many of us know and love, and why and how a brighter future might actually be possible. Trout and salmon have a lot going for them, and I think, notably, that can include us. Thanks for being here. This is Future Wild, presented by Conservation First Bank. Chris Wood, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Mark, it's good to see you, man.
I'm glad we're doing this again, this time on a different show, a different kind of platform, but any excuse to get to chat with one of the most well-respected leaders of one of the most well-respected conservation organizations that I know of is a treat. I'm certainly appreciative of.
Well, I'm not sure I deserve that introduction, but I love chatting with you and I love the work you do, so it's great to be here.
Well, I apologize then for what I'm about to do to you here, Chris, because I want to start with a doozy.
All right.
Gonna drop you right in. And I want you to help explain a dilemma. The dilemma that I think many of the folks listening to this show can relate to. I would love for you to explain for me why it is that salmon and trout drive so many of us absolutely nuts. Why has it driven so many of us crazy and obsessed us and hooked us and caused us to spend so many of our vacation days and our savings accounts and our sanity in pursuit of them? What is it about these fish?
I don't know. I I can think of one or two things that might be better than fishing for trout and salmon, but I'm not sure I know what they are. So I think I'm going to object to the nature of your question. I think there's probably a complex and a simple answer. I think the complex answer is that there's something about these critters that live below the surface of the water. And it's different. I know both both you and I hunt, and it's different when you're hunting to be. I mean, you're sort of in your element, and when you're fishing, you're not in your element, and it takes a lot of knowledge and experience and time spent to become a really good angler. And I can't think of a single time that I went fishing in my life where I didn't learn something. A single time. And as much as I love to hunt, it's not that way when I hunt.
Interesting.
And you're always becoming a better angler, always, just by the people you talk to, the more time you spend on the water. And then I think there's a more complex answer as well, and that's it's for me, and not to get too woo woo here, but fishing is almost an affirmation of our ability to experience the wonder of God's creation. I mean, it's just such a, even whether it's out here on the Potomac, or I've just finished writing a piece that we're going to publish soon, trying to encourage people to perhaps, as it gets warm, and we're about to hit like 105 degrees this week here, to maybe think a little bit less about going out for trout in this kind of weather, and maybe, as I've been doing lately, start plying waters like the Potomac with big clouser minnows and full sink line to go after giant blue cats, which can use the hurt because they're invasive. And DC, our DNR here in Washington, actually encourages you to poke them in the head when you catch them.
Okay. Yeah. Very different than
trout in catch and release. Yes. But I just think there's just something magical about being on the water. I was out this weekend, speaking of the Potomac. We've got this little friends group that I'm a part of here called Friends of Fletcher's Cove. And we did this event on Saturday with this organization called Blue Star Families. And this is serving military families and trying to get them into the outdoors, like trying to help military families through outdoor experiences. And we had about 25 kids. I think I had two parents and two little kids. So the youngest was probably 4, and the older daughter was probably 6 or 7. And just, between untangling the lines and answering questions about everything that, especially that little boy saw, every single thing, I had the best time I've had in weeks. And they caught fish, and now they're hooked, and so there's just something special about that. And so I don't think of it as a curse. I think of it as a blessing.
I'm right there with you. And I can certainly relate to that secondhand joy that comes from teaching, right? Somebody else. I'm in the throes of that with my 2 young sons. We just spent the past weekend up at our family deer camp, and we also did a lot of fishing. We've got a little creek on the property where there's little brookies, so we're trying to get the boys on some little brookies, and then in the evenings we go to a lake down the road and they catch bluegill, and it's so much fun to see them. 2 things. One, seeing them discovering the love of it and the joy of it, and like you mentioned, like there's they recognize and appreciate all the things that we take for granted after having done this for decades. They find so much joy in just the excitement of look at the eye. Look at how beautiful that eyeball is, anything like that. But then also the really interesting opportunity you have to see someone figuring it out, not just how cool it is, but figuring out how to do this thing, how to do this kind of complex activity that requires some precision and some a number of different things all working right together. That's really fun to see in a young person.
Amen. And one of the things I love about my kids are older now than yours, and so we're past this phase, but I get this vicariously through these weekends where we do stuff like we did with the Blue Star Families this weekend. One of the kids, so we have these cool like shale formations, almost like these striations in the rock And this, 4-year-old boy, after asking me about like scars all over my body and why I was losing my hair and why are you sweating so much? And he looked at the rocks and said, why are the rocks like that? And I looked at him and I thought, I don't know. I'm going to have to go look that up.
Yeah.
So kids, they also teach us, they help us to see things that I've fished that river 1,000 times, maybe 10,000. And I've never really wondered about those rocks, but I can tell you for sure this week I will look that up and find out why are the rocks striated that way.
Yeah. Is there any moment in your own life when you were getting into these things that you can point back to as standing out as a moment when you realized, oh wow, these fish, this experience with them, this is like, it's got me. Was there a moment for you or some series of moments when all of a sudden you realize like your life is different now because this thing is so something?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that. And a lot of people assume that because I can't, I work at Trout Unlimited that I came here because I love to fish. And I do, don't get me wrong, I'm a freak. I love to fish and hunt. But I came here because of conservation. It was, the desire to protect wild places and restore areas that led me here. And so I my fishing background is it's more checkered than pedigree. I remember I went to school in Vermont, and I had the Orvis. They still make this. It's like the 10th edition. Tom Rosenbauer's, Orvis guide, Orvis 101 guide to fly fishing.
I have it as well.
I'm sure you do. We all do. And I remember sitting on my dorm floor, cross-legged. It was also obvious in black and white when it was on paper. And then I get to the river and I didn't catch a trout for the first 13 times I went. On the unlucky 13th, I caught a trout, and I'll tell you how I caught it. I was untying a knot in the line, not even a knot in the leader. So it was this Gorgian knot in the line, and my zug bug was trailing behind me. I had a little zug bug on, and after about 5 minutes, some trout came by and ate the zug bug that was trailing 15 feet behind me in the water.
Talk about an act of God.
That was how I caught my first trout.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but but it's I think if there was ever a time where I kind of realized this is it, this is what I want to do. And I think I've shared this story with you, so I won't do it again. But it was in Alaska, and there I discovered salmon. And I grew up in New Jersey, in the Northeast. We didn't have any public lands in New Jersey, and it wasn't until I graduated and I went on this cross-country trip across America with my dog, Gus, in a big box of Dinty Moore beef stew. And, we camped our way across America. And it was just incredible to me, this notion that, you just by virtue of being an American citizen, I have the right to camp on all these lands. And in fact, not only I own them. And, for most of us, it's all the land we're ever going to own.
Yeah.
And that's where I discovered the love of public lands. But the love of fishing happened later that summer. I went to visit my friend in Mickey, and I discovered salmon and the life cycle of these remarkable creatures that, they're reared in fresh water. They remain there for varying times, migrate out to the ocean. They come back after a certain period of time to the very place they were born to have sex one time before they die. And then their decaying bodies provide the nutrients that keep those systems intact. And I was so captivated and taken by that. And again, sadly, this is when I was like 26 years old. Shows how ignorant I was. But I remember that sentiment of learning about salmon and saying, I want to save the salmon. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my career. And I was like, that's it. I want to save the salmon. I want to be part of this great movement of all of us to try to recover these most remarkable of God's creatures.
What's that journey? What does it feel like to have been on that journey now for all the years since then, to have had a moment like that, so impactful, so real and tangible, and then say,
Yeah.
I want to help protect this thing. And now, many years later, you've been a very real and tangible part of doing just that. How does that feel to be able to look back and see that trajectory?
It feels great. I mean, look, when I was in high school, I went to St. Peter's in Jersey City, and it's a Jesuit school. And I had a great. He was a former Green Beret in the Vietnam War, who taught theology, and I was convinced after taking his class as a sophomore I wanted to be a priest, and and I was fine with the vow of obedience, and I was fine with the vow of poverty. It turns out that the vow of chastity became a bit of a bridge too far. And
I get it.
yeah, but and the family is the reason, I have that same sense of service every day that I go to work. I mean, I have told people we have a group of interns. We have 3 of them in here right now, and I tell them the same thing every time I meet with interns, that I come to work every morning like it's Christmas morning, because I get the sense that we're trying to make the world a better place. And whether you're doing that through conservation or through service as a priest, or through whatever else you can do to give back to the world, I just think it's a great thing. So I've got brothers that are investment bankers. One of them's a CEO of a public and chairman of a publicly traded company. And I wouldn't trade what I do. I wouldn't trade a day of what I do for anything in the world.
When you think of all of the different projects underway right now, initiatives, campaigns, the many, many, many different things going on right now that are impacting the future of trout and salmon, what gets you the most excited of the ongoing work at this moment? What is the thing that's getting you? You mentioned waking up in the morning and going to work and being really charged to have this opportunity of service. What specific thing out there right now has got you the most fired up?
Such a good question. It's a combination of the profound and the mundane, to be honest. And I'll start with the mundane. And this is something I just wrote about. Like, if you look at like the Colorado River Basin right now, 40 million Americans, get their water from that basin. It's been in a prolonged mega drought, right? A mega drought. And now there's this, conflict between the upper basin states and the lower basin states that's probably going to be resolved by the Department of Interior, but will almost certainly go to the Supreme Court at some point. And you can look at that issue, and obviously climate change is having a profound effect on the basin. We're in the midst of a 20-year drought. I mean, it's not getting any better. And tragically, over the weekend, we just lost 3 federal firefighters who were fighting a fire on the Utah-Colorado border. And those fires aren't going to get any better. And then in places like the Northeast, you're getting, 100-year floods occurring at decadal intervals. I mean, it's easy to look at that and to basically sort of take the throw your hands up in the air and just sort of say, there's nothing I can do about that. It's like, taxes, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people take that approach. But one of the things that I enjoy about Trout Unlimited is that, and when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, this business that we're in, this business of conservation, like it's really the business of overseeing loss, right? We had 28 trout species in this country historically. We've got 25 now. 3 have gone extinct. Of those that remain, 75% occupy less than a quarter of their historic habitat, right? I mean, and water quality, open space, you can go on and on. And I think it's really easy to become disconsolate or defeatist in the presence of that reality. And one of the wonderful things about TU is, and I think it's because we're an organization of anglers, It's like this addiction that you talked about to kick the show off. I mean, it's why we're perpetually late for dinner. One more cast, one more cast. That's the 15th last cast, and all of that adds time.
Yes.
And so, but anglers are inherently, and I think fly anglers take this to a ridiculous level, we're optimists. We cast this combination of fur and feather and wire at river ghosts, and we're perpetually late because we think that the last cast is going to yield the biggest fish of the day, and so, or our lives. And so we take that sentiment into conservation. And so you look at the situation that I just talked about in the Colorado River Basin, and it's kind of like, well, what are we going to do about it? What is little old Trout Unlimited going to do? Well, the reality is we're replicating, or we're modeling the kinds of things that can actually ameliorate or even help to fix the problems in the Colorado River Basin by doing these small mundane things. Like, we have probably built over the past 2 years 10,000 beaver dam analogs, minimum 10,000. And what a beaver dam analog, it's simply you go in and you drive stakes across a stream, wooden stakes by hand, and then you weave alders or willows or whatever your native vegetation is to try to basically replicate what beavers have done historically. And by doing that, you slow the water down, you create more pool habitat, you create more complexity to the habitat, which is just inherently good for trout, but it keeps the water in the system longer. And then that's good not only for those of us who love to fish, but it's also great for late season flows for irrigators, for example. The longer we can hold the water in these systems, the more that we can recover the natural resilience of these rivers and streams to the effects of climate change, the floods and the fire and the drought. The better that is for fish, but it's also better for downstream communities. And I see that literally. I mean, I don't have the number, but I bet we're working on over 1,000 projects across national forests and private lands in the Rockies, across the West, that help to hold water in systems longer, which obviates the need, for example, to build storage reservoirs, which are bad for fish, definitely bad for salmon. It provides late season flows, which is great for downstream farmers and ranchers. It frankly helps to filter water, which diminishes downstream water filtration costs. And now, is this work, even if we could take it to scale? Like, we've got this proposal, we and 70 other entities have proposed a $2 billion fund in the Colorado River Basin to be able to take this kind of work to scale. Wow. Will that solve the problem? Probably not. Will it make a big difference? Absolutely. Absolutely will. And so, that's the mundane piece, is that these everyday working with tribes, working with our partners like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Reclamation and the BLM, and working with other nonprofits to go out there and just try to help recover the natural resiliency of these systems so they're better able to withstand the effects of a changing climate. That inspires me every day, to know that work is happening right now. And then the profound is really it's the harder stuff, right? It's I got involved in this because I wanted to save Snake River salmon. And the only way we're ever going to save Snake River salmon is by removing the 4 lower Snake River dams. And that's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But I do think it will happen in our lifetimes. And I think it will happen because common sense prevails. And there isn't a single use of that river system, of those 4 dams and the reservoirs that's behind them. There's not a single economic or social use that we couldn't replace. Not a single one. And I just think it's going to take the right political climate and, the right application of common sense to common problems for the common good before we can have the conversation that leads to the vested interest, the ones who want to keep those dams in place, realizing, well, why are we arguing? These dams had a lifespan of 50 years. We're now at year 57. What are we doing here? I can be made better. I can be made whole and better. So it's a long-winded answer, Mark, to your question, but it's a combination of that, just the everyday stuff that TU staff, our 400 staff in the field, and our tens of thousands of volunteers are doing in local communities around the country to, just frankly make our rivers and streams more resilient, and the potential to do really big things. The Bristol Bay, the protecting places like Bristol Bay, and the passage of federal legislation, like my friends Senator Heinrich and Senator Risch, Heinrich from New Mexico and Risch from Idaho, what they made possible in passing Good Samaritan legislation. It's the combination of those two things that get me fired up every day.
Do you think that the dams on the Snake, is that the single most impactful, if you were to wave a magic wand and change something right now for salmon in the United States, is that the thing? Is that like the greatest lever we could ever pull to change the game right now?
Without question. Without question. So you look at that basin, about 45% of it is either wilderness or roadless, the Snake Basin, that is, because of the great, the network of wonderful wilderness we have there, like the Frank Church River of No Return, and then all the 9 million acres of roadless areas in Idaho that, Senator Risch helped to protect. We do a ton of work on the coasts. Like, we're involved in this thing called the Salmon Superhighway, which is this awesome effort on the coast of Oregon to basically help coho and steelhead primarily that aren't impacted by dams, but are impacted by things like culverts that are perched. And when these culverts blow out, they happen to take the road above them, which makes it impossible for farmers to move their products to market. So it's been this great collaboration with like creameries and cheeseries and we've reconnected now. It's like, I think it's 98 of 170 miles that we have for the Salmon Superhighway. The problem is, though, that those are lower elevation areas, and we don't know what's going to happen in it with a changing climate. To be certain, what we're doing has immense ecological and perhaps even more profound social benefits. But the Snake Basin, those are high elevation systems. 70% of that area is high elevation, wilderness quality, roadless quality habitat. That's the best remaining habitat for Pacific salmon in the lower 48. And that is the one thing. And we've got all kinds of like smolt to adult return survival ratios that show the difference between having to traverse 4 dams, because there's 8 dams that they have to traverse to get, up to the, South Fork of the Salmon River drainage, for example. But we have great data in other basins like the John Day Basin and the Deschutes Basin that show what happens when salmon just have to traverse 4 dams versus 8. It's the death of 8 cuts that is making salmon unsustainable in the Northwest, at least in the Snake River Basin. If we could remove those 4 dams, they'd not only have a great chance, they'd have, it's their best chance, without question.
Could you paint the picture a little bit more broadly for someone who maybe is coming into this without the background, as far as why that snake, you mentioned it being a high elevation, wilderness, roadless set of, watersheds there. But how substantial of the salmon, Pacific Northwest salmon population are we talking about that's impacted by this? Like, what's the scale of the impact here? And then can you help me then understand how actually could these dams be removed? What would that lead to? How would that change things? I guess I'm asking you for quite a lot here, but give me the Cliff Notes version of a little bit more detail of why that population is so important, and then what this possible pathway looks like to changing the current situation.
Yeah, so just to give you a sense of, again, we're talking about largely wilderness quality habitat in high elevation areas. So it's better able to withstand drought. It's better able to withstand heat. It's higher in the watershed, so it's better able to withstand flooding. Half of all of the steelhead, for example, in the Columbia River Basin used to come from the Snake Basin. So it was historically the driver, the productivity driver for the entire Columbia River Basin. The snake was. And that's what we've lost. I mean, we haven't had, we haven't, and those, the little towns in Idaho that used to have salmon fisheries, they depended on those. They were absolutely economically dependent on those fisheries. And it would be the biggest shot in the arm to the Northwest's economy that I can think of. And the reality is that, we get about 3% of the, not the power in the US, but we get about 3% of the region's power from those 4 dams. 3% of the region's power. And that can easily be offset by either renewable sources or other power sources. It's a paltry amount of power. We can build rail to move the wheat that is being, or the other commodities that are being grown in places like Idaho and Western Washington. We can extend the pipes down to the river, to a free-flowing river, for the farmers and the irrigators who depend on that system for water, for irrigation water. We can literally replace every single social and economic benefit, air quotes, that's provided by those 4 dams. But the salmon, they need a river. They need a river. And it's not that complicated. Congressman Mike Simpson, Republican from Idaho, a few years ago in 2022, I think it was, he came out with a proposal that basically it would have left the dams in place, actually. His idea was to keep the concrete there, don't breach them, just bypass them, literally build the river around the dams. So we can keep the investment in concrete, I guess, even though it's already outlived its, projected lifespan. We can still keep that and bypass the dams with a river, a functioning river. And the key thing that would happen, Mark, is we get rid of the dozens upon dozens of mile of bathwater warm reservoirs that are predator laden and that are killing the smolt. It's really, there is a 5 to 10% mortality at each of those dams as you march upstream. And if you have a cohort, say of 100 coming upstream, you can do the math at each. But it's the downstream mortality on the smolt. So the juvenile salmon, they don't actually swim to the ocean. They're pushed by the spring freshet. So they're pushed by the snowfall, the melting snowfall and all that creates the spring flow. And they actually get flushed downstream. And when they hit those reservoirs, what used to take maybe 48 hours to get down to the ocean now can take weeks. And they undergo physiological changes. They're more likely to become affected by disease. And really the giant issue is all the predators that are in there. Species like walleye that weren't there historically, bass that wouldn't persist in a free flowing cold water environment. I thought we would get there in 2022. I really did. Maybe it was 2021. And I'm having been in DC for as long as I have, I'm rarely surprised by politics anymore. But a lot of our tribe like to blame the Republicans for everything. But the reality was that we had a very conservative, powerful member of Congress come up with this proposal. And there was one Democrat who supported him. A liberal Democrat from Portland supported him. but the silence on the left was deafening. And I just think it's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of leadership, of course, but it's a failure of imagination to help us to realize that there's a way to bring these magnificent fish back and to make everybody socially and economically whole. And that's our job. Our job as advocates is to help our elected leaders understand that it's in their best interest to do this, and it's in the interest of the people that they represent to do it. And that's the work we have cut out for us.
So speaking of imagination, though, one of the hard things to do, as you just alluded to, is helping people recognize not just the reality of the boogeyman, the bad stuff that's going on. That's easier sometimes to help folks understand and for people to take action against. But it's sometimes harder to help people imagine a better future that's possible if we were to do A, B, or C. But in this case, with the idea of removing these dams, we do have some other analogs to look to, right? Some other places where dams have come down, and we've seen some really encouraging results, right? I mean, can you speak to some of these examples, like the Klamath or any others where we've taken dams down?
A great example is the Elwha in Washington State. The Elwha dams basically blocked habitat for about 100 years. They came down about 10 years ago or so, and steelhead were functionally extinct from that basin because they were impassable dams. And we had a group of scientists go in there and snorkel it a couple of years after the dams came out. They found 300 pair of spawning steelhead. So what happened was the rainbow trout, Oncorhynchus micus, which are the same as steelhead, Oncorhynchus micus, omicus, they remembered that, hey, wait a minute, we can be anadromous fish. So they recovered their anadromy. They remembered, I don't have to be a resident rainbow. I can move down and go into the estuary and migrate to the ocean. And they did that. And then, a more recent example, of course, is the famous example on the Klamath. I remember when I first started at Trout Unlimited, it was a little bit before I started actually, but they had in, I think it was 2000, the Clinton administration chose to shut the river off to irrigators in order to protect an endangered sucker fish. And then there was an election. And in 2001, similar drought condition, the Bush administration shut the river off to the river. And they allowed the irrigators to take all the water they needed. And as a result, there were tremendous low flows in the Klamath. And we lost 30 to 50,000 imperiled salmon and steelhead that year to low flows, to hypoxia and other diseases. And 4 years later, that year class never materialized. And so they shut the commercial fishing industry down off the coast of California for the first time in its history. And it was from that controversy that 20 years later, we were able to negotiate an agreement to take out the 4 Klamath River dams and not only take them out, but engage in, we had actually acquired an organization called the Klamath Basin Rangeland Trust, I think it was called. I could be wrong. But our VP for the Pacific Northwest may have founded it. But they were doing restoration up in that area for a long time before the dams came out. And so, we were able to see fish colonizing and reseeding areas they hadn't been to in 106 years.
Wow.
There's incredibly cool videos. If you want to be inspired, take a look up on, on the internet, salmon returning to the Klamath. They were coming back like right after the dams were taken out. It was unbelievable. And, we're in the midst of a big, hairy project now that, the Nature Conservancy did great work in securing a purchase agreement for 4 dams on the Kennebec in Maine. And the reason the Kennebec is important, we were very much involved in removing 2 dams and bypassing a third on the Penobscot about 10 years ago. And that resulted in huge returns of a host of anadromous fish like alewives and shad and stripers, striped bass, etc. We also saw increases in Atlantic salmon, but the part of the problem is that the population levels are so low there
Right.
that we didn't get the big pulse back like we did, seeing 100 times the number of stripers coming back. But the reason the Kennebec is so important is the Sandy River is a pristine. It's kind of like the headwaters of the Snake. It's this very pristine watershed with great habitat that will now be accessible once we take those dams out on the Kennebec. And we actually think we have a shot there with Atlantic salmon, our best shot in the lower 48. And so, there's examples of how fisheries respond to dam removals around the country, large and small. I was in Rhode Island a few years ago. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to get any of my friends in trouble. But I remember I had been there a couple of years before, and there was a little dam, like a dam you'd build with your kids, like a 6 foot, maybe a 4 foot dam. And the temperature differential on the upstream side was like 8 degrees. It was 8 degrees warmer or 9 degrees warmer in this reservoir created by this little dam than it was downstream. And it was just thermal pollution. And it was also a physical barrier for migrating brook trout. So I got invited to come out there, and we were going to take this dam out. So there were like 15 people, and we had a winch off somebody's Jeep. And we winched this Jeep or this concrete dam out of the river. And I remember we did have a fisheries biologist. I asked him if I could see the plans, and the plans were something he had handwritten on like a napkin.
Nice.
And this is the truth. After we took that dam out, a bunch of us walked up to the trucks to get sandwiches or whatever, and it took us like an hour. And this young woman who was volunteering there came running up the trail screaming because she literally had seen brook trout passing through the opening that we had created in the river, like while we were there getting sandwiches.
Wow.
And so these are, I guess the point in this is rivers and streams are incredibly resilient, and salmon and steelhead and trout, for that matter, are incredibly resilient creatures. And if we give them half a chance, they will come back. We just have to give them that chance.
Yeah. I really like this focus that TU in particular, and others as well, but TU over the years, you guys have leaned so much into the act of and the storytelling around hands-on work and restoration.
Yeah,
and like you mentioned, there's all these different things that can discourage you, but when you have a hands-on in front of your face, experience, and then you can see the change on the ground, A, it makes a difference, and B, it fuels you in a different way, right?
You got it.
I feel like another way you guys have done some storytelling around this is this Conservation Town initiative and list that you guys launched earlier this year. Why did you guys do that? Why are you highlighting some of these specific places where it seems like this kind of thing is happening and having really exciting results?
Well, the conservation towns thing, it's interesting, Mark. We talked, I remember when I started in my career, it was kind of at the tail end of the whole spotted owl fight. It had already happened, and they had come out with the Northwest Forest Plan that, protected, old growth reserves and spotted owls and salmon, et cetera. But the old timers would talk about, what are we going to do about these resource dependent communities? And these are communities, whether it's Hancock, New York, in the upper Delaware, or the timber towns out in the Pacific Northwest that were reliant on, forests like the Willamette cutting 1 billion board feet of timber a year. Just to give you a frame of reference, 1 billion board feet. Today, the Forest Service cuts nationwide about 3 billion. And they were taking 1 billion off that one forest, the Willamette, back in the day. And so, these and the incentives were all twisted and frankly perverse. I mean, so it used to be that 25% of every timber sales proceeds would go to these rural communities for schools and roads. And so the education of people's children was dependent on the harvest of old growth trees from the Pacific Northwest. Like, I mean, talk about a losing proposition to argue.
Yeah, of course they'd want to do that.
Yeah, of course, it's your kids. I mean, what wouldn't you do for your kids? And so, anyway, these and people would talk about these resource dependent communities, and the reality is they're still resource dependent. Today, they remain resource dependent. I mean, I think about Phillipsburg, which is one of these. We named this. We picked 5 conservation town finalists, and we picked Phillipsburg to be the winner. And I think this will be an annual project for us. But Phillipsburg was it had a heavy mining presence, heavy forestry presence, just like thousands of other communities around the Pacific Northwest. And then it all cratered. The mine shut down, the timber ran out, the community suffered. But what makes that community so special, and there's dozens of other communities like this around the country, is they never gave up on the town, and they realized that they wanted to remain resource dependent, but the resources didn't have to be unsustainable. They could be sustainable. It could be the recreation economy. It could be the fishing. It could be the hunting. It could be the people that want to move to an area like that because there's an amazing quality of life. And so we wanted to celebrate those people who never gave up on their communities or who moved there to help build new resource-dependent communities. But in this case, the resources are sustainable. And again, and in many cases, like, if you think about, we've worked in these different conservation towns. I think we've engaged in about 100 projects in the 5 of them over the past decade or so, where we're actively involved with those communities, doing that work you just talked about a moment ago, getting our hands dirty, actively cleaning up abandoned mines, or creating beaver dam analogs, as we were talking about earlier, or helping with tree plantings, or helping wounded veterans to heal through fishing and time on the water, whatever it is. So we felt like we had a presence in these communities, and we could credibly, not as some outside group that doesn't have roots in these places, hold them up and celebrate them. And so, I think this is a cool. If I lifted the computer up and brought you outside, we have a replica of the sign. You know how you drive into a lot of these rural communities, like in my town in West Virginia, you drive in and there's a sign up that says Kiwanis Club or Ruritan Club, or whatever. So they have a conservation town sign up, and we've got a replica over here on our wall. And I just think it's a way to celebrate these places and the resiliency of people who they never gave up on their towns, even though the economic base shifted. They never gave up on their places, and we never gave up on them either. And it's wonderful to be able to celebrate the incredible. I mean, it sounds condescending to say comeback, but it's just amazing to celebrate the resilience of some of these.
And is it fair to say that there are many examples like that? Like this is a growing trend. There are more and more and more communities like this, right? That are seeing conservation pay off in tangible and economic and lifestyle and in so many different ways, right? This is not rare.
It's not rare. It's happening all over the country. And I started out earlier by saying, one of the challenging things about this work we do is that conservation is almost literally about loss, but it's also the single most optimistic, affirmative, forward-looking idea that America ever gave the rest of the world, right? This idea that you and I can take specific actions today. Anybody listening can do this to make the world a better place for your kids. And even if you don't have kids, you can make a better place for those who will come because you believe there will be others who come. Because you have faith. You have faith that we can make the world a better place than the one we inherited. I mean, and that's what communities are doing all around the country. I mean, I think about Phillipsburg. So we did this cool video about conservation towns, and They had, I think there's like 800 people in Phillipsburg. They had 127 people show up to the oldest operating theater in Montana, by the way, to watch this video. 127 out of 800 people showed up.
That's great.
And that it shows you the pride that they have in their community. And I remember back in the day, like in the early aughts, people would talk about, like, these new age economists would talk about like the recreation economy of the West. And it kind of became this divisive thing, this us against them thing.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to have a bunch of lycra clad, freaks coming into my community. And it's so cool to see how far we've moved beyond that. And I do think that it is in part because of the groups like TU that make investments in these communities and don't give up on them.
So speaking of communities that folks have not given up on and encouraging examples, when I look back at the last 20 years or so and I try to find wins, moments where a community of diverse individuals, different stakeholders all came together to protect something they really care about, relevant to salmon and trout, you can't not think of Bristol Bay. Right. And just this years and years and years long effort by so many different people from so many different walks of life, both locally right there on the ground and nationally and statewide. So many different stakeholders came together to save this last greatest stronghold of salmon and so many other fish species. What do you take from that? Looking back on that journey over the last 20 plus years, I've spent a good amount of time over the last couple of years trying to dissect that, trying to understand that. What do we learn from that? What can we take from that for the next, the next battle down the road? And also as a source of hope, because that was a big one. That there were many, many, many financial incentives. Like the financial incentive there was massive. And salmon came out on top though.
Yeah.
When you look at that, what stands out to you is how that happened, as why that happened, as how we can make sure the next one happens.
Yeah, I'll tell you I've never said this before. I just thought of it. The microcosm example of the win in Bristol Bay may have been, and I bet you've never heard of this, the Wyoming Range Legacy Act.
I have heard of that.
You have? Okay,
yeah.
Then forgive
me. But
I
would love for the rest of the audience to hear about it because it's amazing.
So that passed in 2009, I think, in an omnibus public lands bill, which is basically a bill where they grab a whole bunch of different bills that have gone through the regular process, but for whatever reason, it's another conversation. Congress doesn't have votes on standalone bills anymore. And it protected, I think it's 1.8 million acres of the Wyoming Range, habitat to 3 of the 4 native cutthroat in Wyoming from oil and gas development forever. And to do something like that in Wyoming is analogous to stopping a mine in Alaska. Alaska had never, in the state's history, not permitted a mine. And the reason it's also analogous is we did polling in the state of Wyoming prior to leading the campaign, the Wyoming Range Legacy Act campaign. And I think the numbers were like 35% of the people in Wyoming had ever heard of the Wyoming Range.
Wow. That's wild.
In Wyoming. And so we had a huge job to do. And I don't think it was dissimilar to what the job we had to do in Bristol Bay. Most of us, including this guy, hadn't heard of Bristol Bay before I heard about this threat that was posed up there. And we had a great director at the time named Tim Bristol, who encouraged me to get up there. He wanted me to see the Kvichak River, which is one of the rivers that would have been affected. An amazing place. And someone who's become a good friend of mine, Brian Kraft, owns the Alaska Sportsman's Lodge up there. And he took me out and he flew me over the proposed mine site. on Tularic Creek. We sat out on the Kvichak, which for those of you who've never been there, it's this wonderful river system full of braids. And it's just a super cool river. I have this enduring memory I have to share of the Kvichak. And so I fished there a lot of times since then, since Brian convinced me that Trout Unlimited needed to get involved in this campaign.
Smart guy.
Yeah. But I was on the Kvichak and I had to leave early. And so I was actually going to see the CEO of Tiffany and Company, who became a benefactor of our efforts to protect Bristol Bay.
Wow.
Shout out to Tiffany and Company. Those of you looking to buy your spouse a gift, that little blue box, they put their money where their mouth
That's
is
good.
for conservation. But I remember you can fish eggs or beads, which honestly gets a little boring to me. But you can also swing flesh flies or big streamers.
Yep.
And so I was swinging a flesh fly. It didn't look like any other minnow. It looks like a piece of drifting flesh of a salmon.
It's pretty strange. I've done it too.
It is strange, yeah. So anyway, but I remember it. It was swinging, and then you let it get straight, and you lift the line a couple times, and then boom, it hit, and the fish almost sets himself. And then I remember on a 90-degree angle to my right, a fish came out of the water as this one hit, and I turned to my guide next to me and I said, "Did you see that fish jump over there?" And he says, "Yeah, that's your fish." And so that fish was only 25 inches. And it's that powerful that it hit at the end of my drift down there and it came out of the water over there.
So
wild. They're just incredibly powerful rainbows. And, but I remember Brian making the case that, TU needed to be involved in this. And I think the other similarity between the Wyoming range and Bristol Bay is we realized that nobody wanted to listen to a bunch of fast talking white guys from DC. That wasn't, and so much of Alaska's history of conservation, and I'd say for better, has been imposed by the lower 48, whether it's ANILCA, the Alaska Native Lands Claim Settlement Act, or all the land that President Carter protected, the 49 million acres, I think it was. We realized support had to come from the communities. And I think that's one of the things that's coolest about that whole campaign was the amazing support that came from by allowing the indigenous people to lead, by allowing the commercial fishermen to lead. We created, and then the proponent for the mine did some boneheaded things we could talk about, but we created a climate where it became okay for Alaskans to say, wait a minute, we like resource development. We really like resource extraction, but we want to keep the world's finest salmon fishery intact. But, I think that conservation that is most local is often most durable. And this goes back to a question you asked earlier. There's a lot of organizations that do on the ground restoration. You and I are members of them: Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Wild Turkey Federation, and there's a ton of groups that do advocacy: BHA, NWF, the Wilderness Society, NRDC. There's one group that does both, and that's TU. And what we do is we try to leverage the goodwill that we create in thousands of communities around the country to drive policy gains. And there's a reason people don't do both, because it's really complicated. Like when you do advocacy and you litigate things, you antagonize people by definition. You make them angry with you. And so it's hard, but I think that we have managed to find that balance of engaging local voices who are familiar with us. And it was a little different in Alaska because we now, by working with companies like Kinross and places like Resurrection Creek, we actually have a strong portfolio of on-the-ground restoration. Back then, when we started that campaign, we really didn't. But I think there's enough credibility and goodwill that's been created through all those local projects that when we try to engage people as advocates, whether it's for Good Samaritan legislation or protecting Bristol Bay or keeping public lands in public hands, we bring a little bit more street cred than other organizations that just are advocates.
Yeah. Where do you see that this specific instance, the Bristol Bay dilemma? Where do you see that headed? Because I just saw the issue, the clean water protections are being protested in court. Just recently, that came up again.
Yep.
So I think a lot of us feel like it was put to bed, but it's not quite.
It's like
What's yet to come there?
What's that zombie show that never ends? The Walking Dead.
The Walking
it's
Dead.
Like The
Yeah.
Walking Dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a little bit like that. But look, the important thing is that it was the Trump administration that actually dealt the death blow in 2020 by denying the Clean Water Act permit that the Pebble Partnership needed. And, the Trump administration defended their 404C determination in court, that court hearing that you're talking about that just happened last week. I'm hopeful that because we built such a strong ground game from the bottom up in Alaska, and the Pebble Limited partnership has demonstrated that. Let me not even speak to the Pebble Limited partnership. I'm confident that we will continue to prevail there. These court cases will have to play out like they always do. But I'm not going to say, it's kind of like that Monty Python. I'm not dead yet. I mean, it is kind of like that, it's like, I'm not dead yet, but it really is, it should be dead at this point. It's got tremendous bipartisan support. The economics of the mine don't make sense. The economics of the fishery do make sense. But, as with all these things, number one, they take decades. In some cases, they take decades. And you have to stick with them.
So speaking of sticking with something then, and I'm not sure if there is a celebratory way to spin this one, because this one seems like something a little bit the opposite of Bristol Bay, in which there was something that was protected 20 some years ago. And now it seems more and more likely that we are possibly going to lose that. This is what we talked about last summer. You and I had a great chat last year about the roadless rule and what that was, and why so many people were concerned about the possibility of that being rescinded. In the year since, we've continued to see more and more progress towards that, several different attempts to do that in different kinds of ways. All the tea leaves seem to suggest that the administration will follow through with that. It will be rescinded. But tell me what you know now. 12 months-ish since we last chatted about this. Where do you expect to see this end up in the next few months? What's going to happen with the roadless rule? What does that mean for salmon and trout?
As you know, this one is a bit of a passion play for me. I was there at the Forest Service when we promulgated that rule 25 years ago now. And to answer your last question first, from a trout and salmon perspective, the roadless rule is the single most important conservation tool we have. When you look at where native and wild trout and salmon are today, there's a direct overlay with roadless areas on our national forest system. I mean, direct. So in places like Idaho, 87% of all the Chinook and steelhead habitat are found in roadless areas. In places like Oregon, 65% of all the bull trout habitat in various basins are found in roadless areas. In places like Idaho, as you probably well know, you have the longest center fire rifle seasons in roadless areas. And you have, in places like Wyoming, it's about you have a 10 times greater likelihood of succeeding in taking an elk or a mule deer in a roadless area than you would in a roaded area. I mean, we've done a report on this that's at tu.org that's well worth taking a look at, because if this were simply a question of benefits to hunters and anglers, we wouldn't have this conversation. Um, the the social and ecological and economic values of hunting and angling in these places far outweigh the benefits of building roads into high elevation, roadless areas with low timber values so that U.S. taxpayers can lose money, and knowing full well that 80% of our fires start within half a mile of a road and 85% are caused by people. So why on God's green earth would we ever want to put roads in these backcountry areas? It makes no sense. The Forest Service has a $10.5 billion maintenance backlog today. The vast majority of those are a backlog on its existing road system. So if logic were to prevail here, we wouldn't have this conversation right now. And I can tell you that there's absolutely no appetite within the Forest Service for doing this. It's not a substantive issue. It's a religious issue. It's basically there are certain people who just are deregulatory. They don't believe in regulation. And I mean, I remember I sat down with some of the Forest Service leadership, and they said something like to me like, we want to just make sure that all of these decisions are made at the forest plan level. And I said, we did that for 25 years and it wasn't working. The Forest Service was getting crushed by these stupid proposals to build roads in roadless areas. Everywhere they did that, it compromised the social license that they otherwise would have benefited from in those communities to do other projects, to do aggressive thinning, for example, around communities to protect communities of people, and the irony of this whole situation is this report that I mentioned brings this out, our report. We've actually, on a per acre basis, we've done more hazardous fuels treatments in roadless areas than we have in the general forest. It's insane. And so anyway, but to answer your question, I imagine that, and as you know, Congress entered the fray a few weeks ago, and on what would have been a tremendously bipartisan fire bill, a bill to help promote the kind of hazardous fuels treatments that we're talking about here. There was a poison pill amendment that was inserted into that bill that would rescind the roadless rule and then make any such similar rule in the future illegal. So the good news is that the proponent of that idea was the same fella who made clear that he doesn't believe in the very idea of public lands last year. And Mark, you're gonna now get cynical and be like, wait a minute, this guy's always looking for the pony in the pile. But the good news is that I think more hunters and anglers are activated now on this issue because of his doing that than would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And my hope is that we can rally with the same kind of effect and force that we did last spring, not this spring, the spring before, to beat back that boneheaded idea of mandating the sale of 2 to 3 million public acres or public land acres a year. And my hope is the administration, and we've been trying to talk to them about this, that they just try to make it a little more nuanced and don't make it this whole all or nothing thing. And because, we worked on, TU and I personally worked on both the Idaho rule and the Colorado rule. And I know some in the conservation community, some in the environmental community don't love those, but we defended them in court and they prevailed. And I would argue that the Idaho rule is even more protective than the 01 rule that I was associated with, and I was frankly an architect of. And so my hope is that at least the administration will give states the opportunity to advance their own roadless rules, in a regulatory setting, as frankly the Bush administration did, which is how we ended up with the Idaho and the Colorado rule. But it's disheartening, to see that it's such a, I mean, there's so many important things that the Forest Service needs to work on. And frankly, this isn't one of them.
If I were to tell you that 10 years from now, let's say it's 2036, if I were to tell you that in 2036, things were actually better for salmon and trout 10 years from now than they are now, what would have to happen in that 10-year span between now and then? If you can place yourself at that time period, looking back, tell me the story of what happens between now and then that led to us celebrating a better world for salmon and trout. And for my kids, my boys will be 16 and 18, and they're living in a far better world for wild trout and salmon, and they're full of hope and excitement about what's happening right then. They're living in the good old days. What happened to get us there?
That's great. Well, your 18-year-old is leading our chapter in Livingston, and he's the chapter president, and he is the president because he and his friends are so fired up about all of the work that they're doing to help protect, reconnect, and restore trout and salmon populations, and to help make those rivers and streams that they depend on more resilient to the effects of a changing climate. They've both got on their bucket list going to Bristol Bay, but more immediately they want to go up to the Klamath because Dad will allow them to borrow the car and fish for what is now a self-sustaining and healthy population of salmon and steelhead that are returning up there. And most important, they want to be able to use your car to drive up to some of the incredible roadless areas like Kelly Creek in Idaho, or too many to mention in Montana, to fish for native West Slope cutthroat and other native trout in pristine roadless areas that have remained that way. And I will say this, to get out of the, looking ahead 10 years for just a second, although it's in the same context. We shouldn't think that the sky is falling because of something like the proposal to rescind the roadless rule, because there is no appetite at the forest supervisor level in that agency to pump a bunch of roads into roadless areas. Zero, zip, no, none. And it may be that by staying attentive at the local, look, my hope is that, I hate the pendulum that swings back and forth. And one of the things we're not going to talk about today, but we could, is, the Clean Water Act is another one of our, sort of bedrock environmental laws that is under siege right now. And what I would love nothing more is to begin a dialogue with the development community and the agricultural community and sportsmen organizations that do advocacy, and there aren't many of us, to actually figure out if we could come up with a workable solution to clean water rules that allow for some measure of protection for intermittent and ephemeral streams, but provide the certainty and stability that the, ag and development industries need on their end. But we may or may not get there, but I don't think there's going to be a strong appetite to suddenly get into roadless areas that, the Forest Service, they're not that agency anymore that they used to be. The desire to, I remember I used to work with this old time fish biologist. They used to call them combat biologists. And he defined old growth in a joking way as timber that needed to be moved to a home. Get it? Old growth, like an old folks' home.
Uh-huh.
And I just think that agency is in the rearview mirror. And so, I do, I imagine another administration will probably, repromulgate or however, whatever the right word is, create a new regulation that protects roadless areas. I hope they create carve-outs for places like Colorado and Idaho still. But I don't think there's going to be this grand design of lowering the blades and starting to cut roads into these backcountry areas. And if that happens, then I think the Forest Service will have truly lost its way, and I don't think they have. I don't think there's any desire to do that.
I'll throw one more softball at you and see where you take this. um, give me the one thing. You mentioned a couple things here that are possibly concerning, but that you have belief that will work out in the end. What's the one thing of maybe it's one of the many examples we've talked about already, maybe it's something different, but what's the one thing as you look forward that, and I guess I'm circling back to my very first question in some ways, what's the one thing looking forward that gives you that sense of that same sense of excitement that you were talking about earlier about your trajectory and the years that have led you to this moment? What's that one thing when you look forward to the next 10 years, 5, 10, 15 years? What's that one thing that makes you believe that better future my kids will hopefully experience could actually happen?
I have two answers. One is just my experience with our brand of conservation. We call it collaborative stewardship. That I've seen it yield wins. Like we've talked about the Klamath and Bristol Bay. There's 10,000 wins in little small projects all around the country that nobody will ever hear about on a show like this that are providing thousands of high-paying family wage jobs across rural America. So that's one answer. And the other is more recent. And, I think for years, sportsmen and women were taken for granted by one political party and ignored by the other. And I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yeah.
And it was something to behold to see hunters and anglers rise up the way we did in opposition to the sale of public lands. And there's still 58 million of us, that's a big number. And, if we can continue, I don't even want to say begin, because there's groups like BHA and NWF and TU and others that are doing a great job of helping to give voice to hunters and anglers. But if we continue on that path, I think that it could become an incredibly powerful political force, even more than it is today. And that gives me great hope.
I'm right there with you. And I'll tell you one other thing I'm right on board with is I do see that same future with my kids possibly being leadership roles at their local chapter of TU. So I just want to get out ahead of that and just throw it out there. If there's any career opportunities for them, let's say 10 years from now at TU, just letting you know. Keep an eye out for that Kenyan last name and get them at least an interview. All right.
Yeah. No. So just so you know, I'm gonna probably regret this, but when I came to DC, I came here because I wanted to do policy work. So I started in Idaho, doing working for one of the research stations out there for the Forest Service. But I was dating a girl who lived in DC, and so I wanted to come back here and I wanted to do policy work. And I think I had 32 informational interviews. And mom and dad had bought me a suit when I graduated. I did 32 informational interviews. On the 33rd, I got offered a job that was an internship that was free. That meaning I didn't get paid; it was free.
Yep.
I could work for free at this organization, and I made a vow, which I have kept to since then, that I will talk to any kid that wants to get involved in conservation as a career, because I had 33 people who were willing to do that for me when I was completely clueless. I didn't even know it until I had that trip to Alaska. I didn't even understand the life cycle of salmon. It's almost, I'm like the perfect example of fake it till you make it. The fact that I'm the head of Trout Unlimited and, in my mid-20s knew nothing about salmon.
Well, what you had that helped you is what I think we all have as hunters and anglers, and what is, to your point, the thing that gives me a lot of hope for the future too, which is that hunters and anglers are incredible optimists. By nature, that is the thing that keeps us out there in the field day after day.
That's right.
Because we believe it's going to happen. Today's going to be the day. And,
amen, brother.
And that's going to keep us moving forward in the right direction, I think. And I appreciate your role in making that possible too. Thank you, Chris.
Oh, thank you, Mark.